Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to the next session in the Authenticate conference. This is called Authentication, What Do Regulators Want? My name is Jeremy Grant. I'm part of the cybersecurity and privacy team at Venable. We're a law firm based out of Washington, D.C. I also, in that capacity, have been working for several years as an advisor to FIDO Alliance on policy and regulatory issues. And I wanted to take some time today to talk a little bit about, when it comes to authentication, just what is it that the regulators want? So as part of setting the stage, I think it's pretty clear to anybody who's been working with regulated industries, which is, arguably the majority of industries across the world. Regulators, they feel like they're born to regulate, and they're constantly looking for what sorts of new rules they need to put in place to govern all sorts of things, including authentication. And when we start to look at the landscape of authentication regulations across the globe, it really hits a lot of different categories in terms of where they pop up, from banking and payments, to healthcare, telecom, how to protect critical infrastructure, how to do authentication in a way that reflects privacy rules in different countries, particularly with the use of biometrics, and also how we put solutions in place that can support access to government services. What governments have to say about authentication often has a significant impact on what types of authentication are used. And I want to spend some time today talking about the evolution of what we've seen in this over the last few years. So government really tends to have three actions on authentication. And you'll see I've got the whole circle with the arrows going around here to talk about how they all influence each other. So first, we see government weighing in on authentication through standards or other guidance that they'll put out in terms of how different implementers ought to be using that. We then see the regulators often pick up on that and often reference that guidance or standards. And finally, we see government influencing the authentication market and what solutions are used through the deployments that they actually use. And I think one thing that we've seen over the last few years is that all of these really tie together. The standards lead to regulations, the regulations lead to what the government's going to deploy itself, and all of these things feed into each other. And, up front, I want to point out also that authentication is important to governments for a few different reasons. One, agencies actually need to have strong authentication to protect access to their own assets. Second, it can enable more high-value citizen-facing services. Third, authentication empowers the private sector, if it's done right, to provide a wider range of high-value services to consumers, whether it's in banking and payments and health and electronic commerce, and also protect against cybercrime and fraud. And fourth, authentication is getting increasing attention these days as a really important layer when it comes to cybersecurity risk management to secure critical assets and infrastructure. I think a theme across the globe that we're seeing is governments are seeking identity solutions that can deliver not just great security, but also do it in a way that's good for privacy, that's standards-based to drive interoperability, and also can deliver better customer experiences. One of the things that we've seen is, FIDO has started to really take hold in the marketplace the last few years, is the realization that, many governments have had that FIDO isn't like other authentication. FIDO specifications offer governments newer, better options for strong authentication, but we're seeing that governments have had to update some of their policies to support the ways in which FIDO is different. And this is perfectly natural. Technology is constantly evolving, and as it evolves, policy needs to evolve with it. What we have seen across the globe, though, the last few years is a few different myths that continue to pop up as different governments are either promulgating new regulations and standards or otherwise looking to weigh in on this space. And so I wanted to take a few moments up front, both to talk about myths and facts in the space and also to look at how things have evolved over time. So one of the first things that we've seen has been this idea that we really don't need to put mandates in place for strong authentication because it costs too much and it's just too much of a pain in the butt for users. And, this was something that came to a head here in the US about 5 years ago. This quote that I have pasted up here is from some comments and regulations from the US Department of Health and Human Services as they were looking at considering, do you have a requirement for MFA when it comes to different health IT systems? And somebody said, well, you don't want to do that because it's costly and burdensome to implement. And I think what we're seeing the last few years is the market's really changed. The solutions are getting better. So while this statement that was made to HHS might have been true of a lot of old multi-factor authentication technology, FIDO specifically addresses a lot of the cost and usability issues, enabling simpler and stronger authentication capabilities that governments and businesses and consumers can easily adopt at scale. Second, we've seen a myth that I think at one point was rooted in fact, which was this idea, and a lot of this really dates back 10 or 15 years now, that if you want to have true security, at least one authentication factor that you're using has to be physically separate from the device. And a lot of this, might have made sense in the day if I was actually sitting down at a laptop and maybe bringing a smart card or other token with me and you wanted that physical separation. And there also might have been issues around how to protect authentication factors in a device. I think what we've seen now is that technology's evolved and it's mature enough to enable two distinct secure authentication factors in a single device. And the reason for this is largely driven by the evolution of mobile devices, in particular, the hardware architectures that we're seeing today that offer highly robust and isolated execution environments. Think about the secure enclave in Apple devices, the trusted execution environment in Android devices. It's allowing these devices to achieve a very high level of security without a need for a physically distinct token. And in fact, I've got a memo here, on the right that, was put out by NIST back in 2014, where they basically stated we need to go back and literally change these requirements that we used to have because technology's evolved. We've seen this in Europe as well, where in 2017, when the European Banking Authority put out their draft technical standards around strong customer authentication for Payment Services Directive 2, their original draft talked about the need for isolation, and then they revised it in part because of input from FIDO and a lot of others in the industry that was making them aware of these new architectures that were out there. And they specifically pointed to it being okay to have two factors in a single device if you had the use of secure separated execution environments inside what they called a multi-purpose device like a smartphone. The third myth I think we're seeing around the world is the idea that all MFA is the same. Just as long as you're using something, it doesn't matter what you use. And I think we're starting to see a realization now that attackers have caught up with a lot of first generation MFA tools. Really any tool that's based on shared secrets, whether it's an SMS text, a one-time password, people know how to phish those now. And so it's putting users and online services at risk. The way to address this is through high assurance authentication, where at least one factor uses public key cryptography, thus allowing you to get around the risks of the phishability of a lot of legacy MFA tools. And with that, it's important to know PKI is not the only way to deliver high assurance authentication. FIDO is based on public key cryptography and it provides a viable alternative. And in fact, we saw a memo just last year in the US from the White House, Policy on Identity, Credential, and Access Management, that specifically opened the door. The US government, as background, has been very PKI centric. And here they said you can use other solutions also based on public key cryptography, essentially a nod to tools like FIDO for when PKI is not feasible. So I think there's been a real evolution over the last 5 years. 2015, look, FIDO was just starting to emerge. Most governments hadn't heard of it. And as we were seeing regulations and guidance come out from different countries around the world, regulations largely focused on assuming that the only way to do MFA was either a one-time passcode or through PKI. What we're seeing now in 2020 is FIDO is increasingly emerging as the preferred choice of governments around the world. And I want to give a few examples of what it is that we're seeing there. So first, there was a memo that just came out, I guess about 2 months ago from CISA, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security Cybersecurity Agency. It was talking about types of MFA you should be using to protect election infrastructure. And they specifically called out FIDO2 security keys as the single best type of MFA that campaigns and other election organizations should be using. They also said, look, if you can't use that, use something else. You can use one-time password. SMS and email are still out there, but they've got issues. What was notable is they basically pointed out that every other type of MFA that was in their list is phishable. And so, you can see the quote here pointing out that physical security keys do something that the others don't do, which is if a user's tricked into supplying their password to a phishing website, you have a physical security key that'll still block attackers from accessing their account. You're really seeing DHS embrace this idea of high assurance authentication is what you really need to use these days to block attacks on other types of MFA, and specifically calling out the FIDO keys as the right solution. We're seeing this as part of a broader trend of recognition of FIDO. So over in the UK, Good Practice Guide 44 was updated earlier this year. It's their authentication guidance for government applications. When they listed high-quality authenticators, they specifically pointed to solutions, including those that are FIDO certified, as meeting that requirement. And we're seeing this as well back in the U.S. from NIST, where NIST back in July put out a series of implementation resources, essentially additional guidance on top of the core digital identity guidelines that they put out a couple of years ago. And they highlighted, by name FIDO as a tool that you can use to implement Special Publication 800-63-3, both for single-factor cryptographic devices like FIDO security keys, as well as multi-factor cryptographic devices, meaning embedded in endpoints like smartphone or the laptop I'm talking to you guys on right now. They also noted in the guidance that FIDO authentication can be used to deliver what they call verify impersonation resistant authentication, essentially meaning that there isn't a way to dupe somebody into giving the authentication key over. And they pointed out that FIDO can do this, but one-time passwords and other tools based on shared secrets cannot. And we're also seeing this in Australia, where the folks at the ACSC, the Australian Cybersecurity Centre, it's a division of the Australian Signals Directorate, which is essentially the Australian version of the NSA. Their guidance on implementing multi-factor authentication pointed to FIDO security keys and specifically pointed to the FIDO Alliance's certification page, saying make sure you get one of these if you're going to be using this technology. FIDO is also recommended as a way to use MFA in the ASD's, what they call their Essential 8 maturity model, pointing to 8 different critical cybersecurity controls that every organization ought to be using. Australia's also started to point through their Digital Transformation Agency and their guidance on citizen-facing services to FIDO's biometric certification requirements. So this is not as well known, I think, as the core work we've done in authentication within FIDO. But the biometric certification requirements have specific performance specifications that you're now seeing adopted both by the DTA as well as in the U.S., the National Security Agency, where guidance that they put out, I think just about 2 months ago now, on different types of tools that agencies can look to use for MFA. They talked about both FIDO solutions and specifically pointed out that if you're going to use biometrics as one authentication factor, most of the tools that are out there don't have an independent certification that are out there to actually look at how good it is. And you want to look at tools that have been certified, and they pointed, among other things, to what FIDO has been building on. So there's been a big trend here of governments now calling out FIDO by name, as well as describing the need for next generation high assurance MFA as opposed to some of the legacy tools that are increasingly coming under successful attack. On a global level, probably the most important thing that has happened, not just this year, but I would say arguably in the last 5 years, has been a new set of digital identity guidelines that were released earlier this year in March by a group called the Financial Action Task Force, or the FATF. So the FATF is a really important and influential organization. It's also one I found most people have never heard of. It's a really interesting group. They are a global standards body made up entirely of financial regulators from across the globe who are charged with, in each country, making sure that that country's financial system isn't used to support things like money laundering and terrorist financing. It's essentially a global group putting out standards for the entire financial system across the globe to preserve the integrity of that system. So they've been heavily focused on digital identity lately. As you might imagine, it's a big issue in many countries. And so they put out some new guidance for different regulators across the globe to be following as they're creating regulations in their own country. And it's a very impactful document in that if you're a country who participates in the FATF, which is essentially most of the world, you'll have to align or update your regulations related to identity to focus on this guidance. So FIDO, we were really pleased to see, was referenced throughout the document and actually called out as a preferred approach. Much like a lot of the other agencies I've talked about, the FATF decided to focus specifically on the importance of phishing-resistant MFA. And just to give a few examples of where it's referenced throughout the document, first, they talk about how FIDO can be used to create a credential after identity proofing. And they point out, as you're looking at the binding between identity proofing and authenticators, how one of the things that is acceptable to link to an identity proofing would be a FIDO certificate. Second, they specifically get into some of the issues around MFA vulnerabilities and talk about how the first generation solutions are coming under attack. And you can see in bold in the middle of the page where they wrote that phishing resistant authenticators, where at least one factor relies on public key encryption, can combat these vulnerabilities. And they specifically called out PKI and the FIDO standards as the tools that you want to be looking to. And on page 65, they referenced FIDO, specifically an embedded FIDO certified authenticator that's part of a mobile device as a way that a consumer might log into a bank account with MFA. So we were really excited to see this, and that this is almost the Bible that every regulator across the globe has to come back to as they're updating their guidance. And so we expect it to be pretty impactful and help really pave the way for greater use of FIDO in financial services. We're, in the U.S. also, I think this is a U.S. example I'm providing, but across the globe, we're seeing regulators focus more than ever on identity and authentication challenges. So in the U.S., our Treasury Department has a division called FinCEN, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. In September this year, they came out with a statement. This is actually a screenshot from the slide presentation that they gave, pointing out just how bad things are getting, what a problem this is. They're now seeing that identity-centered attacks are leading to more than $1 billion every month in U.S. cybercrime. And that's through a mix of identity fraud and synthetic identity fraud, business email compromise, account takeovers. You can see some of the details in this slide. I think everybody's known for a long time that identity leads to a lot of attacks within the financial services space. But we've never, until now, seen law enforcement come out and start to put some specific numbers to it in terms of what they're seeing. And, the fact that they've revealed this and also pointed out just how much worse things have gotten amidst the COVID-19 pandemic with, all sorts of new opportunities for financial fraud emerging as we've seen the more or less elimination of in-person transactions. It's helping to get much more focus on the importance of really having strong identity and strong authentication solutions that are out there. Finally, I wanted to touch on, at a high level, from sort of a cybersecurity strategy level, the emergence of FIDO starting to impact how governments are thinking about authentication. So back in 2016, the UK government put out their national cybersecurity strategy for the last 5 years, for the next 5 years. One of the things they focused on was ensuring, how do we start to move from tools where we have to buy technology and then bolt security on to how do we have this built in as a default? And they specifically pointed to things like TPM and FIDO, which are now being embedded in a lot of different products that you buy across the globe, as the types of things that they wanted to invest in as a priority to improve the entire country's cybersecurity posture, both in government as well as in terms of what individuals are doing. And likewise, we saw this in the U.S., a report that came out about 4 years ago, making recommendations to the government on what they should be doing with cybersecurity. Also called out FIDO and talked about specifically, if you look at the second paragraph, how Microsoft has embedded it into Windows, and since this time we've now seen support from the other platform providers as well. But you're seeing this come into the strategy documents in terms of, if we have this capability that's now built into so many of our devices and browsers and operating systems, how do we start to use that as a way to better protect against attacks? And finally, we're seeing that governments across the globe are also embracing FIDO for their own purposes. So in the US, we've seen login.gov, which is a single sign-in service for citizen-facing applications. It was actually one of the very first FIDO2 deployments anywhere in the globe. The US Defense Department is using FIDO solutions, and a lot of applications where it's not feasible to use the Common Access Card, which is their smart card and PKI platform. The Canadian Digital Service is using FIDO. In the UK, the National Health Service, NHS, has built FIDO into their consumer-facing app as the login layer. The Ministry of Interior in Taiwan, and in Hong Kong, the Securities and Futures Commission. So, we're seeing things in standards and guidance, in formal regulations, and in government deployment, as I talked about before. So at this point, we're going to shift over to the Q&A phase. And if you've got questions on how government might view FIDO in your country, either feel free to reach out to me. My contact information is below, or we can jump into some questions now where I might magically show up wearing a different shirt. Thank you.